Misty's major books include Female Playwrights and 18th Century Comedy, Negotiating Marriage on the London Stage. And that was her first book, which came out from Paul Raven in 2002. And of course, what we're talking about today a lot, Imagining Methodism in 18th Century Britain. Misty supports the profession and has been supported by scholarly bodies very much in her very worthy work. She's had fellowships from the Walpole Library at Yale, the Beinecke Rare Book Manuscript Library at Yale, the Tennessee Humanities Center. And one of the main ways that she contributes, besides being active in ASEX and being on the MLA Executive Committee for 18th Century Studies, is being the longtime editor of Restoration, the journal. And I think many of us have benefited from her generosity in helping us at early stages of our career when all important articles needed to come out before tenure or pre-tenure reviews, and soliciting our work and helping it come out in Restoration in a timely fashion. So that's really wonderful. If I got off on just saying how just personally lovely and kind Misty is, we'd be here all day. But I wanted to actually read a paragraph from a review I wrote of Imagining Methodism, because it speaks to, I think, a lot of the concerns for the flavor and shape and texture of our critical work that I think Misty's book, especially Imagining Methodism, just has in spades, that is really meaningful. So I found this book so fascinating. I mean, the portrait of John Wesley that's in it is worth the read on its own. I mean, he's a vegetarian, a social activist, a theater goer. I mean, it's just so lively what comes across about Wesley in this book. The chapter on hymn singing I was recommending yesterday is just fabulous, really getting at both the poetry and the somatic bodily experience of feeling community, spiritual community, and the hymn singing of the Methodists. But here's what I had to say when I tried to articulate in a review what I loved best about this book. I said, perhaps the highest praise I have for Anderson's worthy volume is the strangest, that this book made me reflect, ponder, and even hope in ways that I most often find myself doing in genres of writing far removed from the scholarly or the academic. That is, I felt, dare I say, not just educated, but inspired reading about John Wesley and his care and tireless labor for others, his intellectual vigor, and his humble dealing with those above and below him in every form of publicly measurable status. From the environment in which I perform my intellectual and pedagogical labors, I realize I have a longing for the same sort of community-building faith, affect, and conception of personhood that Anderson is writing about, and that critique, as it is currently conceived in the humanities, does not supply. I don't make any hard and fast claims about this aspect of the book, but I report that for me, it is there. And my sense is that it grows from both Anderson's intellectual prowess, but also from deeper human motivations for scholarly work that we talk about only rarely. So that's my high praise for what I really love about Imagining Methodism. So let's give her a round of applause.
Well, it really is an honor to be with you all. These short couple of days, it's flying by too fast. And I'm going to thank Lori and Mark, of course, for all the work you've done to put this together. And when I look around this table and I think about conversations that some of us have had about doing this work, I'm aware that we all write books in community. And as isolated as that operation is, we are having some conversations, some really good ones. So what I want to share with you today, by way of introduction to Spiritual Quixit, is a little more framing out of the argument in Imagining Methodism in the way I'm thinking about it right now. I've been thinking about time a lot. And I also wanted to give you glimpses into two projects I've got cooking right now. One on the verge of silly, it's called Evangelical Hair. And the other part of my God on Stage monograph, which someday will be there, about deep time in Derbyshire. So here we go. And I thank you also for getting the technology sorted out so we can do this. Just a few images to show you. So in my time today, I mostly want to talk about time, specifically the function of quixotic time in the Spiritual Quixit, Graves' ultimately soft satire of Methodism. But I also want to talk about things, specifically hair, architecture, and caves, which become the bearers of time. Quixotic narrative architecture entails a broad, imaginative retreat into the past that stands in comic tension with the episodic experience of time and action in the narrative present. Okay. So Quixotes don't quite connect with people in the present. They move, but they don't seem to progress. 18th century literature explodes with these heroic, born late readers who make a break for the past as a coping mechanism with an alienating modernity. Dozens of translations, theatrical iterations, and adaptations of Cervantes, especially after Joseph Andrews, with its subtitular claim that it is, quote, written in imitation of the manner of Cervantes, hit the literary market. You all probably have your own favorites, but the female Quixote, the philosophical Quixote, the political Quixote, the amicable Quixote, the benevolent Quixote, all these iterations of Cervantes united by their unusual uses of the past to make sense of an uncertain present. I would also add as a sidebar, there are a number of stage Quixotes who turn up in after pieces, and they were probably parts of puppet shows. It's very hard to reclaim what's going on because there's very little text, but the Quixote and the Harlequin are together on stage. All right, well, Wild Goose wants to go back in time, like all Quixotes, specifically to return to primitive Christianity. He finds modernity too secular, perceiving the greatest threat to Christianity not from external competition, but from internal disuse and invisibility. Now, to be modern in the timescape of this novel, and I'm thinking also about the novel's relationship to 18th century modernity too, which we can talk about more. To be modern is already a negative condition, not to be primitive. Like Rule Britannia's Britons never, 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 never shall be slaves. It is an us created by a them. But modernity, in its temporal break with the past and with others, also births iterations of religious meaning and of religion in the present, as Assad, Leger, and others have argued, including primitive and fundamentalist orientations to religion. Wild Goose tries one of these on, but he's still working within the Protestant set of cognitive moves that include abstraction, metaphorization, that structure what it means to be rational, British, free. Right? And here I'm thinking about Christian Smith's living narratives and the experience that Wild Goose and other characters have of these living narratives once they have been sort of disassembled from Christian narrative, don't quite fit back together on the back end. They don't all go together. So Wild Goose's attempt to recapture the evangelical objet petit a, right, this primitive Christianity, is problematic because he has no real community in which to do it. The Methodists represented here are anarchic individual readers. Wild Goose meets through Whitefield people who read this way, and this is Whitefield describing his Bible reading community. They were great advocates for the right of private judgment and for the liberty of interpreting Scripture their own way, who looked upon all creeds and confessions of faith as unjust impositions and as insults upon the freedom of human nature, who were for the independence not only of each congregation on other churches, but of every individual on each other. Here, meaning or revelation is immediate, it's personal, and it's embedded in this eschatological vision of transformation that compresses time and meaning. Getting back to the original meaning is something that you do individually, and you can only make sense of it that way. In a few more years, this reading strategy would yield John Nelson Darby's fundamentalism, the paradox of an authentic biblical truth revealed only through a unique individual and present interpretive act, the Schofield Reference Bible, and that brand of Christian futurism, the escapist rapture, right, which continues to exert such a hold over American evangelicalism. So, back to Wild Goose. Graves, as Collop, in his essay on Quixotism, registers the ways that Wild Goose is both out of sync and modern. He calls him a modern itinerant reformer, and says, by the mere force of imagination, these men have conjured up the powers of darkness in an enlightened age. They are planting the gospel in a Christian country. They are combating the shadow of popery where the Protestant religion is established. We could spend all day on that passage, but note that as in Northanger Abbey, right, when Edward exclaims to Catherine, when she reveals the Gothic plot she has constructed about his mother's death, she says, remember that we are Christians, we are English. Right? So Christianity is coincident with being British, or at least English, and that seems self-evident to a reasonable self. It is to be in the eternal sunshine of British reason rather than the darkness and shadow with the pagans and the Catholics. But Wild Goose, in his concern that not all Britons might be Christians, refuses to agree that translating God into civil society is good enough and asks a reasonable question: isn't there more to Christianity? For Wild Goose, growing up and into a modern self means marriage. And here, Soni's critique of the narcotic happiness of marriage is wonderful. We can see that the narrative theology of affect as heaven is also present here. Though Graves emphasizes marriage in communities, true parishes with relations between many others. For the plot, though, marriage must displace all other possible forms of meaning, especially evangelical fervor, such that Wild Goose jokes at the novel's end about his newfound, quote, enthusiasm of another kind, which coincides with his ability to talk very rationally upon religion. It feeds nicely into a bourgeois narrative, but not without complications and potential dividends. Quixotic novels strike at the dominance of the marriage plot Sony atomizes, even when they participate in it, because they foreground a desire for a heroic, meaningful life, for structures, stories, and interpretive frames. Even though they must be abused of that spiritual quixotism, Quixotes like Wild Goose ask important modern questions on our behalf. How do we find a meaningful narrative about the past, specifically about our religious past, that we can live with in an era of seismic change? So let's take his quixotism seriously for a moment and use it to think through three different kinds of objects that bear the freight of time and get into our Wayback Machine with him. Hair, architecture, and rocks. Here we go. So Jeffrey Wild Goose has a mimetic problem, and that's actually the word that Graves uses, because he wants to be someone else, in particular, some version of George Whitefield and a Puritan reformer. He has, and again, this is Graves's term, a virtual self, right? Not a real one. He is one confused dude, a case study in the temporal confusion that was Puritan and later Methodist hair. The short history of hair in the long 18th century was that short hair on men meant Puritan allegiance until it didn't. The classically Puritan case against long hair came from Puritan divines and doctrinaire stylists like Thomas Hall, who denounced men's hair, quote, when it was so long that the godly are thereby grieved, the weak offended, and the wicked hardened. The short title of this is The Loathsomeness of Long Hair. It's one of those magnificently long titles, though. So Hall included this cautionary verse in his tract, which urges, go, gallants, to the barbers, go. Bid them your hairy bushes mow. God in a bush did once appear, but there is nothing of him here. So short hair, as an objection to cavalier and courtly style, however, met with its own counter-reformation just a few years after Hall's treatise, when Archbishop William Laud instructed all clergy via a 1636 statute to wear their hair short. Many Puritans, especially higher-ranking ones like Oliver Cromwell, Thomas Fairfax, Andrew Marvell, and John Milton, rebelled against the new Church of England edict and began to grow their hair. So many others followed these leading Roundheads, thus quickly confusing the visual economy of hair length and religio-political allegiance. Take a look at this. This is a gallery of prominent Puritans, and just think about the term Roundhead. Right? Well, these are the Roundheads. Now, it's definitely not the bowl cut club, though we do have some caps going on there. Also, these are three images of Milton. And so thinking about this temporally, the one on the left is Milton at 10, we think. It's a drawing after a lost portrait. And there you see the very short hair. And then Milton at probably 16. And then later on, the more famous image that was copperplate. Okay, so it is no wonder that in Paradise Lost, Adam's hyacinthine locks, manly hung, clustering, but not beneath his shoulders broad, and Eve's wanton ringlets doomed generations of critics to parse the question of whether this is prelapsarian hair or a sign of the fall. Right, it's going up and down. Wild Goose's textual self-fashioning, in imitation of our primitive reformers, depends on visual cues from the Roundheads turned long hairs from the frontispieces of the books he is reading, most likely images of Cromwell, Bunyan, Milton, and perhaps Marvell. But Wild Goose is temporarily caught between the forces of national and personal history, neither Roundhead nor Methodist until his hair grows a few more inches. His hair did not yet, quote, extend below his ears, and he made but an uncouth appearance to those who had been used to see him in a decent periwig. Graves uses Wild Goose's liminal mane to point out the affectation involved in the experience of Methodism, in which politics and religion return as farce or mere fashion cut off from historical implication. The same could be said of Methodism itself, the critique, right? Which one of which was that people feared it would turn into another Puritan Cromwellian bid for the political nation. That turned out not to be true. Wild Goose's A Dissertation on Periwigs attempts to straighten out the history of hair, moving from the Stuarts, who first used false hair and then wigs at masks, then adopt them as courtly fashion. Then the general public follows by adopting the wig, to the absurdity and the volume of modern periwigs. But when Wild Goose brings his dissertation back to the defense of his own hair, he gets confused. He argues that hair, when worn naturally, gives, quote, a softness to the features by rising in an easy manner from the forehead and falling loosely down upon the parts which it was designated to cover. He longs for the natural hair prior to culture, pre-political hair in the divine image, but his idealized hair both rises as from Adam's forelock and falls to cover the parts that need covering, like Eve's veil. So Wild Goose's polymorphously perverse hair can't get him back into the garden. Graves regards Wild Goose's self-fashioning as naive rather than hypocritical. He's just not yet fully conscious either of his bad haircut or of how hopelessly modern his quest for the primitive is. Now, The Spiritual Quixote, in many senses, is a novel about being able to recognize the right story of Great Britain and place oneself in its future, not in its past. As I've noted in Imagining Methodism, Graves voices a concern through his characters that Gothic architecture or other architectural anachronisms might, quote, mislead future antiquaries and introduce great confusion into English history. And in fact, this happens in the novel, right? Especially in cases like Lord Bathurst's Gothic country house, which was built old. Graves regards this as a problem that can be resolved by better reading practices, but the confusion of representation and reality that undergirds it does not resolve so easily. We see this when Shenstone actually enters the narrative as Wild Goose upsets the statuary in protest of the pagan worship of Pan. Shenstone, who was a school fellow of Graves at Oxford Pembroke in the 1730s as the Oxford Holy Club began, chooses to laugh rather than rage at Wild Goose, and to leave the statues overturned as a more entertaining choice, incorporating Wild Goose's protest into his garden and his history, which is available to the right reader as a joke. Another question, however, about how moderns consume rather than experience the past lurks behind the jokes and the architectural objects of the novel. The Bell Inn has become a tourist trap because Fielding mentioned it, even though the inn is really there and is really where Whitfield was born, and Whitfield's mother still operates it, and she's mean. The historical place that Wild Goose seeks has been overwritten by fiction. which easily dominates historical fact and in the process troubles linear temporality. You may have noticed that Sir Charles Grandison also makes an appearance by way of a relative here, near relation. Time after time, wild goose is taken in by kind people who live in Gothic homes or in houses that are referred to as from before the Reformation. They are the social glue of his travels, but he seems oblivious to their kindness, their goodness, and their stories. In fact, as he is hearing all of these different stories, he responds usually with a one-line sermon simplification. Right? This happens until he begins to connect with the pre-Protestant past and the hospitality that he finds there. Many of these houses, like Chatsworth House and Gardens, which gets a brief mention, as part of the Derbyshire tour, right, with its elaborate waterworks. Chatsworth House was a monastery, a church property that enriched the nobility in that deliberate worlding, as Colin Yeager puts it, of the formerly sacred. Chatsworth House, which is perhaps where Mary Queen of Scots was kept, became the seat of the Dukes of Devonshire. And in the political present, wild goose, let's see, there we go. Oh, sorry. There are some of the anachronistically Gothic buildings. The one on the right, you may know from New Haven. That's Chatsworth House. In the political present of wild gooses of the narrative time, the Duchess of Devonshire, Georgiana, was beginning to become politically active on behalf of Fox. Chatsworth also served as a backdrop in Drury Lane for the first act of The Wonders of Derbyshire, and theater managers kept it because it was so beautiful. People just loved coming in to look at it. Soon, Chatsworth House will make a cameo in Pride and Prejudice, and of course, it becomes the set for Pemberley in the 2004 movie. So these architectural moments and Wild Goose's encounters with architecture speak to the sense of both loss and connection in post-Reformation history that unmakes the past by making it available to present tourists. These buildings, relics of the past, right, the remains, the sacred objects, the bearers of the past in the present, are also still where some people live. What does it mean that so many of Wild Goose's accidental sponsors live in pre-Reformation houses? And to what degree does their hospitality have a cumulative effect on him? In contrast, we can see his movement about the country as a kind of spiritual tourism. Tourism, the modern secular displacement of the pilgrimage, reduces sacred and formerly sacred spaces to items on the buffet of experience, styles, and spectacles. What might then a meaningful non-tourist relation to place look like for modern people? What must remain sacred, set apart for that relation to be meaningful over time? Okay, and finally, rocks. Problematically, one of the biggest tourist attractions of the age was Derbyshire, which Wild Goose and Jerry visit twice. Tourists came to see the wonders, which included the natural caves, the houses, and the mining works. It was so popular that it was turned into an actual theatrical spectacle by legendary designer Philippe de Loutreburg. Does anybody know about Wonders of Derbyshire? It's part of a series of really pantomimes, but unlike afterpieces, they were so popular people would just come to see them. So they're almost full-on spectacle. And de Loutreburg was the master designer of the period. He goes on to build the Eidapusicon. You may have heard about this. It's kind of like a very elaborate magic lantern show that had scenes from Paradise Lost and all kinds of special. So it's the history of special effects. Sidebar. Okay. So the Wonders of Derbyshire staged time in a series of, that's one of the castles that's also around the space. So Chatsworth, this is Peveril Castle, and then here's some of the things that are in that Derbyshire cave, okay? This is an image of actually supposed to be the Lisbon earthquake, and oh my, I'll get back to him in just a second. This one's a little out of order, but this is the maquette for the wonders of Derbyshire. So it's a series of irregularly cut out flats placed at irregular angles to give the appearance of an infinitely receding cave. From a set design point of view, this was just a watershed moment. The image of infinity was fundamental to the experience of the place. Tabitha Bramble, you may remember, with her scandalous malapropisms, reports that they have seen the devil's harse a pike and hoyden hole, which hath got no bottom. Right? So when Whitfield suggests that he might send Wild Goose to these subterranean inhabitants of the lead mines at the peak of Derbyshire, who are sheep without a shepherd, Jerry excitedly jumps in, but as a geological tourist. Right? Odds bobs, I should like to travel into Derbyshire and see the wonders of the peak. There's a hole in the earth without any bottom in it, as they do say, and a passage into the other world, which they call the Devil's Arse Peak. I do not know what they call it, replied Mr. Whitfield, but by all accounts, the devil has extensive property and great power over the whole world at present, especially among these poor people whose subterraneous employment cuts them off from all chance of spiritual instruction. But I hope by the help of my good brother here and other friends, we shall soon make the devil's kingdom shake to its very center. So Whitfield's riff on the devil and geology is an example of the heavy metaphorization on which Methodist and evangelical discourse depended, but it also reflects the experiential intensity of this region, its sublimity, and the related questions of whether God or Satan might be immanent in the material world. The alleged bottomless Eldon hole, it had not yet been fully fathomed, defied rational apprehension. At the same time, this was earth that opened to an industrial modernity, where miners tunneled with new technologies, including modern coal-fired pumps driven by commerce and capital. So Derbyshire and the geological paradigm shift, its example of deep time signified, give us a peek into the emergence of the relationship between fundamentalism and modernity. We get a brief reference to Noah and the flood as a marker of time, but it's precisely that time marker that these geologic digs were starting to question. So Thomas Chalmers fretted about the skepticism of geologists, as did some geologists themselves, who were concerned about the implications of their discoveries, especially the fossils in the walls of the Peak District. Again, I'll take you back to this. No. There. The fossils, especially the prehistoric shellfish that, quote, monstrously exceed the life, led to calls that they must be supernatural and were never cast in animal molds. The geologic record was challenging Protestant biblicism and Diluvian conceptions of time with troubling visual evidence. Even before Darwin, the work of Short, William Strata Smith, and others struggled with the fossil record and a six-day creation, trying to place it prior to all geologic evidence, but that would remove God even further from earthly time. Multiple eruptions of Vesuvius through the century, particularly with dramatic lava flows in 1760, 1767. In fact, there's a joke about this in Humphrey Clinker going to cook a steak at Vesuvius. The earthquakes in London, Portsmouth, Liverpool, the earthquake and tsunami in Peru, and the Lisbon earthquake of 1755 had raised interest, concern, and geologic awareness about the seismically active planet, the problem of theodicy, too, right? This comes up in Crusoe. We can go back there, too. And a new sense of deep time that would reshape aesthetics, biblical creationism, and conceptions of God. At the same time, a handsome 23-year-old Rayton was about to depart with James Cook's crew on the HMS Adventure for his celebrated 2-year stint in London as, quote, the noble savage for the patrician set. The map of the earth was filling in, yet history seemed to be breaking wide open, revealing the world to be at once primitive and modern. I'm going to skip over a little bit because I just feel like am I running a little long here?
You're fine. You go ahead. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Let me tell you a little bit more about those de Lutherberg pieces. Okay. As Bruno Latour has put it, a modern is someone who believes that others believe. The thinly disguised class narrative about primitive belief versus modern science in Derbyshire unfolds through multiple encounters in the novel. Tugwell, who believes stories of fairy races down in the caves, roars in terror when the locals send him down into the lead mine in a basket. He remains the primitive within the modern, like Friday, and like Friday in the subsequent de Lutherberg Harlequinade, the 1781 Robinson Crusoe or Harlequin Friday, or the multiple magical Tahitians in his later Oh My. Lutherberg's set and the now iconic costume from his illustration of, there we go, his illustrations of Crusoe offered audiences the pleasure of believing in Crusoe, the shaggy modern who triumphs over primitive nature with guns and umbrella and use value. Lutherberg let audiences do vicariously what Rousseau wanted Emile to do, actually, to play Robinson Crusoe. But after that first scene, the plot of the Harlequinade, such as it is, concerns Harlequin Friday, who mingles with supernatural figures. Friday and the subsequent Oh My fall into the other category in the emerging discourse of world religions, Christians, Jews, Mohammedans, and the rest, alternately referred to as pagans, heathens, idolaters, or polytheists, and configured more as nations at different stages of historical development. Uh, Nations at different stages of historical development rather than as a plurality of belief systems, according to Tomo Mazuoka. Tugwell gets to be the Christian primitive, not quite pagan, but too close to a world of still sacred matter that he has not yet mastered. The representation of that paganism through both cannibalism and Catholicism in Robinson Crusoe, and Tahitian rituals and sacred objects in Oh My. There are these talismans, and characters fly through time to go recapture them. These things gave audiences the experience of spiritual rustics through a tangible, elaborately staged object world. Okay, here we go. At the end of the novel, Dr. Greville, who is described as the true example of Christian primitivity, is the model that Wild Goose has been looking for all along. As the plot and Greville draw together all the characters of the novel back to the home territory, Wild Goose begins to participate in community through theological discussions with Greville. His faith generates actions, material consequences that work and do work in the modern world. This is an economy of hospitality and mutual aid. One can see them as orthodox or primitive Christianity, but his orientation to community also works as a kind of secular community. Either way you look at it, it is a vision of a kind of heaven on earth that reaches beyond the individual satisfactions of the marriage plot. After reorienting Wild Goose away from his enthusiastic mission to save the nation, Greville does admit that the modern world is fallen, that it is not improving, that it needs saving. But what it has to be saved from is a capitalist narrative of unbounded accumulation by the rich. His cure is a narrative of class emulation in which the wealthy self-regulate, the middling rank of people no longer propagate the follies they learned from their masters, and the working classes magically become more industrious. The quixotic conservatism of Graves' vision preserves traditional class hierarchies, quite obviously, but it also challenges the endless accumulation of capital and its capacity to distort time. These distortions include Crusoe's, quote, rash, immoderate desire of rising faster than the nature of the thing admitted, right? Which is how he talks about gain in Brazil, right before we find out that he falls into a horrible depression about this. Graves, in his own way, gestures to the way that modernity, under the discipline of capital, hijacks time. It yanks us into an alienated experience of the present and undermines community. Catherine Tanner, in her recent Gifford Lectures, and the Gifford Lectures of this series is a 19th century series actually established in natural theology at the University of Edinburgh, and when Charles Taylor gave the Gifford Lectures, that led to a secular age. So Tanner just did the lectures about a month ago. Tanner speaks of the endless present of finance-disciplined capitalism, the temporal distortion experienced by many late moderns in which unmanageable debt erases past and future into an endless state of present emergency. This is, she is absolutely only making claims for the 21st century, but I think it can be a useful presentism to think about the connections here. In our own time, the experience of imagining no future, no heaven, and living just for today is feeling less like a John Lennon song and a little more like the Hunger Games. Tanner proposes a remedy, a Protestant non-work ethic. Non-work was actually one of the chief concerns about Methodism that ironically E.P. Thompson turns into its opposite. The complaint was, and we see people leaving work all over this novel, was that they didn't work. A Protestant non-work ethic, in addition to rethinking the critical narratives that make Christianity take the fall for capitalism, highlights the value of non-labor time, whether liturgical, contemplative, or leisure, as creating community and the possibility of making meaning. How then might we think Graves' quixotic and admittedly problematically conservative address to capital as meaningful, providing terms other than the affective deferrals and temporal distortions that make only moments available to Julie, and Sony's argument, the endless costs of Crusoe's time, or Wild Goose's rejection and then embrace of relationship, both to past belief and present community. So, with that, I hope we can launch in.
Thanks so much for that, Rob.